Coming up, an inside look at ABC News.
Journalists, even the very best journalists, respond ultimately to what the audience really wants to come to. News organizations have to respond to what people are going to come to.
Former ABC News president David Westin discusses covering 9/11, the future of journalism, and the legendary Peter Jennings. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is David Westin, who from 1997 through the end of 2010 was president of ABC News. Whether reporting on President Clinton's impeachment, the contentious 2000 presidential election, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our speaker has always, first and foremost, made clear his concern for a journalist's responsibility to the public for delivering unbiased news.
My first job in journalism was running ABC News, which is not a typical route to it, which had certain challenges attached with it, a certain degree of skepticism from within the newsroom and from the journalism community more broadly, and a fairly steep learning curve. I knew about ABC News fairly well because I had been the general counsel of a company, had represented news, and had worked with the news people quite closely. And then I'd run the entire ABC television network, and so news was part of that operation. So I knew the people there. But for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to work inside a news organization, until you're inside it, you really don't understand very much about how it works. The first big breaking story that I was involved in was the death of Princess Diana. I had been there about 4.5 months. It was late August of '97, if you remember. Labor Day weekend. So most of the senior staff was dispersed, was off somewhere. And I was at home up in Westchester, so I got a call from the desk. They're the people who would call at home in the middle of the night or on the weekend or something to say something's happened. And it usually was not good news. But I got a call saying there's been some sort of a car accident in Paris involving Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed, whom we knew something of just because she'd had sort of a whirlwind romance, if you remember, for the 3 months or so before that. And we don't know, she may have been injured, we're not sure. And then, as often the way these things develop, there's a series of updates that are all over the map. She is injured, she's not injured. She injured her leg. No, it was something, she injured her arm. And it was, Dodi Fayed's dead. No, Dodi Fayed's not dead. So that's the way the first information comes in and you're not sure. And we were doing sort of what we call special reports, which are live reports to the full network, sort of intermittently with our weekend anchor, Kevin Newman. I concluded late in the afternoon that this was enough of a story, and it was a little bit suspicious how the information was trickling out. I thought it felt a little bit like someone was trying to manage it, that I went into the newsroom and I said, I think that she may well be dead, and they're just not telling us because they want to try to get their own act together about how they want to make this major announcement. So after checking on what we had some resources, particularly radio, ABC News radio resources in Paris. We had a substantial London bureau at that point, so we had people in London, and we had some people in New York to cover. So we were pulling together resources to figure out how we could report out the story, still doing special reports, every hour or so. But one of the things I did was I said, let's get ready for a primetime special tomorrow night, because if in fact it turns out she's dead, I think we will want to put a primetime special on. Now, bear in mind, we had like 24 hours to get this ready, and to put together a full hour or more from scratch with all of the video you have, the reporting you have, the writing you have, the editing you have, in 24 hours is a big feat, so you need to get going. So I called in some people, and they started working on the special. As the evening progressed, there was the announcement, ended up coming not from the palace actually, but from the hospital in Paris, that she had died. And then we went into full special report, just stayed on the air. And so we were on the air live with Kevin at his anchor desk, and the call came in from Peter Jennings, who had caught up with the story from his long weekend away. And so I took the call at the news desk, just off camera from where Kevin was live broadcasting. And I remember I've been on the job 4.5 months. This is Peter Jennings. And Peter had some skepticism, I think it's fair to say, about me. By the way, one of Peter's great strengths is he was always skeptical about just about everything. It made him a great journalist, and often made him spot on when other people were going for conventional wisdom. As an aside, later, Peter was the one that I remember, at least in our newsroom, who expressed skepticism about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And he and I, ironically, more than once had the discussion in the lead up to the war when we were talking about how we would cover it and what the plans were for the military and how it would work out. More than once, I would say, well, whatever happens if we go in, we will find WMD. And bear in mind, we were at this point putting reporters ready to go in embeds, and they had all of their gear, their chemical suits and things like that they were drilling with, so we really believed it was there. And there were lots of sources, really lots of credible sources that said there were weapons of mass destruction. So it's not like we didn't report the story. But every time Peter would say, don't be so sure, David. Peter was skeptical. I mean, I think we all would have been better if we'd followed his skepticism. I think not because he knew something that we didn't know, but he knew a lot about the world. He'd covered a lot of stories. He knew just to generally be skeptical, and he particularly knew that part of the world. And he knew that nothing ever was as it seemed. So I wish I'd followed him there. But this time, Peter had a strong view, and as I picked up the phone, he said, David, I understand Princess Diana's died. And I said, that's right, Peter, Princess Diana's died. He said, I also understand you're considering a primetime special. And I said, yes, I've got Phyllis and other people in working on the primetime special. And Peter said, well, that is your right. But I feel I owe it to you, David, to tell you no one will ever take you seriously as the president of ABC News if you do a primetime special on that woman. And so I hear it's about 11:20 at night, and I'm brand new, and I'm more or less by myself, and I've got Peter Jennings, whom I have enormous respect for, who's a legend in journalism, saying your first major news call is way off. It's just way off. So I gulped. I didn't have a vast experience in journalism to draw on to deal with this, and so I drew on my family. I'm from Michigan. And I said to Peter, she wasn't a head of state, but I have a sister in Ann Arbor, Michigan, who does not read tabloids in general. But from the moment Diana got engaged to Prince Charles, she's followed every single detail about this woman's life. And I think that there will be other people who will feel that way. And I said, that is your right. I will have nothing to do with it. And that was the end of the conversation. And so then I stayed there until about 2 in the morning or so, helping getting things ready and getting people in position and getting people on planes and all that sort of thing. But one of the things I did was say we have to find somebody to anchor our special because we don't have our lead anchor. And so we called Diane Sawyer and Barbara Walters. And they said, of course, we'll be happy to anchor the special. No question. So I went home. I got home 2 or 3 in the morning. And first thing the next morning, the phone rings at home. And it's Peter. And Peter says, David, I'm in the car. And I've read all the coverage. And you were right and I was wrong. And I want to do the special. So I said, Peter, absolutely, you are our lead anchor. You should do our special. But I owe it to you to tell you, I already have signed up Diane Sawyer and Barbara Walters to anchor the special. And so if you do the special, you're going to co-anchor with 2 other co-anchors. And to Peter's credit, he said, fine, I'll do that. And so we ended up airing a 2-hour special, not a 1-hour special, a 2-hour special. We had enough material that Sunday night, anchored by Peter Jennings, Barbara Walters, and Diane Sawyer. And a little twist on it, I went back and read the transcript from the special. And early on in the special, Peter turns to Barbara and Diane and says, when you first heard this story, did you think it was a big story? And Diane immediately says yes, and Barbara says, oh my, yes. So this is Peter playing this out psychologically. So that was my first real baptism with a news call with Peter Jennings. Now, again, Peter Jennings was a superb journalist, and it was a great privilege to have served with him, worked with him closely, and gotten to know him really well over the years. He was much more often right than wrong. And the point of this story is not that Peter happened to be wrong on that one. I mean, if you think about it, even the story of whether you would do a primetime special on Princess Diana today seems quite antique. I mean, today there would not be any discussion. At the time, as far as I can tell, going back in history, no broadcast network had ever done a primetime special on the death of anyone other than a former U.S. president or a pope. When Elvis Presley died, they didn't do a primetime special. So in fact, the Diana decision actually was a watershed. I mean, it was saying, yes, we're going to do that. Today, it would never be thought about. But the much more important point that Peter was raising, and I did understand this at the time, he was asking, are we covering this because this is a really important story, or are we covering this because your sister back in Ann Arbor, Michigan really wants to know about it? And that was a question that came back throughout my tenure at ABC News. Are we doing this story because it really has overall historical importance? and the people really need to know this? Or are we doing it because people are very, very interested in it? And there, in my conclusion, after having dealt with this for so many years, there is no simple answer to that question. There is a constant wrestling going on about that, because on the one hand, you don't want to simply cover things that people want covered because that's pandering. On the other hand, if you're not covering things that people are interested in, as I said once to one of our other anchors who said he didn't care about ratings and I shouldn't, I said, well, then you're keeping a diary. You're not a journalist. If you're a journalist, you by definition think what you are reporting is so important, you want as many people to pay attention as you possibly can get. You have to care at some point about how many people are paying attention to you. 9/11, in my mind, is probably the biggest story that we cover. And I mean, everybody in this room has their own personal memories of 9/11 and where they were on that day and what was happening, how they learned about it, and how the several days after followed. And I was in my office, actually, because I tried to get in by the time Good Morning America started at 7 in the morning. So I was in my office watching. I had 9 monitors, believe it or not, on my wall. We were in commercial break, and I saw the smoke coming out of the first tower on CNN is actually where I saw it. And then we came back and we went into a special report with Charlie Gibson and Diane Story, and I watched the second plane go in. And obviously it was hectic. It wasn't bedlam because it was very organized. Our desk was superb, but it was a question of both trying to find out what on earth was happening, what else was going to happen, because it seemed there for those first few hours that there was another thing, another thing, another thing. And it was either real things like something's crashed into the Pentagon, or it were reports from all over the country of bizarre things that we didn't know whether they were happening or not. And it was a great challenge just to get our arms around what was happening, vetting it, so we're not reporting things on the air that are wrong. At the same time, we're not just saying the same thing over and over and over again. Peter got into the chair by 9:15 or so, and Peter, in my way of thinking, Peter was the greatest live news anchor of his generation. There was nobody like Peter live. He knew who he was. He could report on the air because he was a great reporter. He could filter this and know what to report and what not to report. He knew what to question, even live on the air, of correspondents or people phoning in or something like that. He also, and to some extent we at ABC News, were positioned well for this story, if you can be positioned well for such a horrible thing. We had, ironically, just a few years before, in '97, my first year there, we had aired John Miller's interview with Osama bin Laden. John Miller at that point was a correspondent with us, and he had hiked with his producer over the mountains in Pakistan into Osama bin Laden's camp and taped an interview with Osama bin Laden. And ironically, one of the issues that came up early in my tenure was whether we would air that interview. I mean, you think back in history, there was a spirited debate in the newsroom about whether this was a serious threat to the United States or whether this was basically a show-off, that Osama bin Laden was simply seeking a lot of publicity. And there was a serious debate about whether to air or not, and we did. I'm happy to say we did decide to air it, in part because we thought there was certainly a larger issue about extreme Islam terrorism looming, and whether it was bin Laden or not, that he was representative of a larger set of issues. So we had reported a fair amount on terrorism, on bin Laden specifically, on Al-Qaeda, and so we were somewhat prepared for that and knew that part of the story. So we were positioned reasonably well, if you can be, for such a thing. But then we stayed on the air for about 100 hours straight after that. And it was, as you know, it was chaos and upsetting and wrenching. One thing that struck me early on was how much we expect of journalists at a time like that, because it was obviously a deeply distressing time for all of us personally. We wanted to reach out to our families. We wanted to be with our families. We wanted to, try to absorb this and internalize that. And it was the time when you couldn't do any of that. You were going flat out, just trying to do the journalism. And the sacrifices people made were quite extraordinary. The commitment and the dedication. We had one funny story. That morning, we started getting emails at the desk from an unrecognizable email address. And it was some funny name like Sexy Girl 463 or something like that. And we kept getting these emails in. And we thought, what is this person sending these emails in? It took us the better part of half an hour to realize it was George Stephanopoulos. And George had managed to get down very near ground zero. He'd taken the subway, and then the subway didn't work. He got out. Cell phones didn't work. And he talked his way into some woman's apartment and borrowed her desktop computer and was trying to report into the desk desperately, and the desk was ignoring him. And it took a while to figure out that's actually George Stephanopoulos out there. The other story that I love is about a dear man named Hal Bruno, a name you probably won't remember, but Hal Bruno was our political director for many, many years at ABC News. Wonderful man, and an avid volunteer fireman, which is relevant to the story, as you'll hear, dedicated to it. And he had retired a couple of years before 9/11, and so we talked a little bit, but hadn't kept up that much. So as the day of 9/11 plays out, we had these boxes on our desk called 320 boxes, where any correspondent or reporter from around the world could phone in and go live on your little squawk box and report something. And so the 320 was going all day long with somebody reporting something and some rumor and something. So about midday, I'm sitting at my desk, and the 320 goes off, and it's Hal Bruno reporting in. And I thought, wait a second, Hal Bruno retired 2 years ago. What is he doing? And what he had done is when the plane went into the Pentagon, he worked his way down to the Pentagon and volunteered to help the firemen. And so he was helping fight the fire and reporting in for ABC News from retirement. To show you the kind of dedication that these men and women have. It was pretty extraordinary. During my time at ABC News, the news media changed fundamentally. In 1997, MSNBC and Fox News were about 2 or 3 months old. They essentially didn't exist. We did not have a website at ABC. We created it my first year there. Much less social media, much less Twitter or Facebook or Google search or anything like that. It was an entirely different world. The tent that includes the news media has gotten much, much bigger. There is something for everyone now, of every sort. You can get heavily opinion-laced journalism if you want it. There's a lot of that. That's expanded dramatically. You can get rumor. You can get salacious reporting about scandal. You can also get serious reporting to this day. And most important of all, I learned, you cannot simply put it on the shoulders of the news organizations or the journalists to decide what the news media is. Because there are two people in this relationship, and the other is the audience. Journalists, even the very best journalists, respond ultimately to what the audience really wants to come to. News organizations have to respond to what people are going to come to. So if people want more substantive reporting, more investigative reporting, more foreign, whatever you want more of, it is there to be found, and if you come to it, you will get more of it. It's up to us increasingly, the public, to figure out the difference, to weigh it, to ask ourselves questions about it, and reward with our time and attention the really best of what is in journalism. And if we do that, I think we'll be just fine. That we'll go forward, and journalism will be fine, and it'll be different, but it'll be just fine. And if we don't, then I'm a little more worried about the country. But I'm actually very optimistic overall about the possibilities for the future. Thank you very much.
The issue of national security and disclosure by the press, particularly as highlighted by the Pentagon Papers and WikiLeaks, is certainly an issue which is a very fine line. Where do you come down on that?
If we have something we think may have serious national security, we must check with the responsible government agency, both to find out if it's true and to give them an opportunity to make a claim if they want to make a claim. If someone makes a claim, then I learned pretty quickly, I need the head of the agency. I'm talking about the head of the CIA. I'm talking about the Attorney General. The head has to call me personally, because it rapidly became clear that you can have people down the line, particularly in the public communications area, who it's almost free for them to ask for a story to be curtailed, without regard to whether it's a real national security. And if they get it killed or changed, then they're a hero, right? But they're not really in a position. So I said, look, if it's serious enough to ask us to change our reporting, then the person has to call me. And I had some of those calls. And the third thing was, every one of the calls, I would say, okay, I need to understand exactly what the national security issue is here. Explain to me exactly how the national security would be harmed. I had one of these officials once say, well, it'll be an embarrassment for the U.S. government with the local government. I said, well, a lot of what we report is embarrassing for the U.S. government, and that's way too broad. I mean, if that's the national security concern, you have to show me. But on the other hand, We had an instance where Martha Raddatz, our Pentagon correspondent, early in the Afghan war, it would have been the fall of 2001, had information about a special forces operation behind enemy lines that was still ongoing. And we checked, and it was absolutely true, it was ongoing. And they said, please don't report that for the next 3 or 4 hours because we want to get our guys back out. Now, as a practical matter, was it likely the Taliban was watching ABC News and would hear it? No. But was there some chance in the age of the internet? Some chance. So I said, absolutely, we can hold that for 3 hours, no problem. But the last thing was, besides asking for specificity about exactly how national security would or could be harmed, the last thing was, and I had this debate once with a head of the CIA, it's my call to make, it's not yours. It's on my shoulders. The government doesn't get to decide that. And he was very upset. He said, why do you get to decide that? And I said, well, you don't have an argument with me, you have an argument with the Supreme Court. Go to the Supreme Court. But ultimately it has to be on the journalist's side to make a responsible decision.
In the general world, people often say disparagingly that news has become entertainment. And the personality of the journalist or the reporter is so important, and that there are enormous egos involved. So how do you deal with this situation?
Well, first of all, I can report that there are enormous egos involved, which can be challenging. At the same time, I'll pick on my departed friend Peter, for whom I have enormous regard and great affection. He wouldn't have been the journalist he was without an ego. So ego in the right place at the right time is important because it takes a fair amount of courage to pursue some stories and to get on nationwide TV and talk to millions of people and put your reputation on the line. I think 2 or 3 things. First, there's a big difference when it comes to personality between print and television. There are a handful of personalities in print, but by and large, when you read reporting in the New York Times, at least I connect it with the New York Times, not necessarily with the byline. It's the reverse in television because you are looking at someone and you have the appearance of knowing them, and you're connected more with a person than you do with the network, usually. And that's inherent in sort of television. That said, personality some places, my experience, is terribly important. In other places, it's not as important. It's terribly important in the morning. Historically, the morning programs are driven to some large degree by the personalities and they're likable. Primetime, not so much. I also think that one of the shifts, this is a prediction now, so it could be wrong. One of the shifts we're seeing as we go into the internet and mobile for more of our news is a shift from generalists to specialists. In the days of Walter Cronkite, or for that matter, Peter Jennings, you really wanted a generalist giving you the news in the evening, and there's still a role for that. But increasingly, when the audience is coming off of the internet, you're going for a specific purpose. You're going for, it can be politics, it could be national security, it can be investigative, things like that, but you're going for names that are in that specific area, and then they appear across a lot of different programs. So I think there's a big shift.
At one point there were hour-long news shows when it first began. Then it's a half an hour, and there are many predicting it will go to 15 minutes and maybe even less. What is going to be the economic future here?
You have to care about the business of journalism if you care about the journalism. It's a false dichotomy to say, I only care about the journalism, I don't care about the business, because it takes money to do good journalism. It requires investing in reporters who have beats and develop sources and develop skills and things like that. I believe there's no substitute for that. So you have to start with, we have to be able to bring in enough money to pay the journalists and invest in the journalism. Advertising has been wonderful for many years. I don't see that going away right away. You see, in terms of a network, a broadcast network, sort of a range. The evening newscast still brings in a lot of revenue. And people don't understand it. Is it less than it once was? Yes, it's less than it was, but it still brings in a lot of revenue. The morning programs have come up in terms of their contribution. I think in part because when we wake up, we haven't been on radio and the internet and things like that, so we don't know anything. By the time evening comes, you've been barraged with news all day long. But when you're asleep, presumably you're not. But that's come up. So it's a balance within the portfolio. I mean, one of the big challenges for an organization that really does try to do good original journalism is how powerful the cable news business model is. because cable came along, and particularly when Fox News went the opinion direction, and then increasingly followed by MSNBC, that is a commercially very powerful structure. And it's commercially powerful for two reasons. One is it's not that expensive. You don't have to have a lot of reporters out in the field. You can pay a fair amount of money to a personality to come in and have opinions, and it's live. It's not tape, it's not edited. It's actually a fairly inexpensive way to do 24-hour-a-day television. And the second thing is, it may not reach as big an audience because it is partisan or opinionated, whatever you want to call it, advocacy. And that necessarily turns away a significant part of the audience. But it's a very engaged audience. That level of engagement in the cable world, as you know, Rita, you know this well, really is a powerful business model when it comes time to negotiate with the cable company. Because if you can get 10 or 15% of your audience to say, I will drop my cable subscription, if you do not have, for example, Fox News on, you can demand almost anything from the cable provider economically. And that is one of the big concerns, because the cable news model is not based critically on original reporting when it comes to Fox News and MSNBC. It's a powerful model. My hat's off to them. They figured it out. It's very successful. But it's not based really on let's make sure we have a lot of reporters doing original reporting. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great. Really great.
Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.